Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Rabbi.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to continue a bit, Yosef. It says, Chen Katav Rambam also says this, Beperk Vav, V'zeh Lashono. He says, Posek Adam im agoy ala milacha. So Rambam says like this, right? A person can make a deal with the goy, right, regarding labor. The kotzetz damim, so he's going to make like a fixed rate. The goy oseh le'atzmo, so then the goy will be doing the labor for himself. He's not really working for the Jew per se. He's doing it for his own fee that he's charging there. ואף על פי שהוא עושה בשבת מותר. And even though he's working on Shabbat, is mutar. It's mutar. So what's mutar? That even though the Jew owns the establishment, still allowed to operate it on Shabbat. Number one. Number two, he's also getting a cut of the profits, right? Which is partially coming from Shabbat. So that's what it means when it says mutar. Right? That's only if it's something in private. But if it's something, which is done in public, and everybody looks at it and sees it, asura, it's going to be forbidden to do that. Because when people see that the goy is working there in your establishment, they don't realize, that you have a partnership with him. He's a contractor, whatever it is. They think that the establishment belongs to you. They associate it with you. So this brings a problem of ma'atain, right? Of suspicion. So look what it says, right? Therefore, if he makes a deal with a goy to build, right, in his courtyard or his wall, right? In other words, he's doing construction, renovation on his property. And liksort sadeu, or liksort sadeu, or he's working on his field, right, to harvest the crops. Or shesecharo shana or shanat shtayim, or he hired him for a year or two, right? It's like a lease, gave him a lease. Livnot lo chatzer, to build a courtyard. So it's not a lease, it's a contract. He's a contractor. Okay. Or litalo kerem, or he's gonna plant for him a vineyard. Im hayta melacha b'medina. So he says, if that melacha, right, the work was in inside the community, the populated area, or בתוך התחום, or within the town boundaries, אסור לו לנכם לעשותו בשבת. So you're not allowed to allow him to do it on Shabbat. That's the thing, you know? I always get this question, like periodically, similar question, for Chol HaMoed, Passover, Sukkot, right? So I have a friend, who's building a house. And, the contractor wants to work on the holidays. He's a goy. So he calls me up, every 6 months, when the holiday comes. Rabbi, am I allowed to let, the goy work on Chol HaMoed? So he's not even asking about Shabbat. He's asking about Chol HaMoed. So the truth is, on the laws of Chol HaMoed, over there it says that even on Chol HaMoed, you're not allowed to tell the goy to do this. Not only Shabbat, Chol HaMoed also is not allowed. So every time I tell him, no, sorry, it's not allowed. You gotta tell him to desist from the labor. Sorry. So why is that? Because they're doing work, which is readily visible, to everybody. Contracting, construction, everybody sees them, so there's no way to allow that. That's the idea. So then he goes on. But he says, on the other hand, right, if the labor was going on outside, the vicinity of the town, mutar, then it's allowed. So here's the thing, that, in the areas that we live in, which are like, urban areas, so, it's really get hard to find a place which is outside the town. So most of the places that we have are inside the town, obviously. So therefore, it would not be allowed, unless you have like a home in the forest somewhere, where it's really out of town, like altogether, it doesn't belong to any town. So if that's the case, then it will be allowed. But such a thing is very rare nowadays, especially in the urban areas. Because usually, it belongs to some kind of township, or some kind of a, right, some kind of a society going on there, whatever it is. It's not just some loose property, in the forests, it's not like that. Okay, great. So that's the story. That's how it works over there. But if it happens to be in a place like that, boondocks, it's allowed. Because there's no Jews there, nobody really lives in that place. So therefore we're not really concerned. Katav Ramagid. So says Ramagid, at Kanashim, that's the end of that story there. So this was the Rambam. Yeah. Let's move on. So says Ramagid, Posek Adam ima goy ala melacha. That the person, as we said, right, is allowed to make a fixed rate with a goy regarding his labor. Mishnah per kama. So it says it's brought down in the Mishnah in the first parak of Shabbat. Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. Bet Shemai Omrim. It says over there. Bet Shemai says, "En notnin orot leavdan, velo kelim lekovse nochri, koves nochri." So it says we're not allowed to give hides, right, to the tanner, and not also utensils to the. He means to say clothing, right, to the kobes, to the launderer, nochri, who's not Jewish, unless they can do it before the holiday comes in or Shabbat, whatever it is. So it says in all these cases, Bet Hillel allows all these things. So just to explain to you, right, what's the machloket here? According to Bet Shammai, you're not allowed to give the goy, the work to do, unless you can finish it before Shabbat. Bet Hillel tells you, no, give it to him and let him do whatever he wants. He wants to work on Shabbat. That's his business. You didn't tell him to work on Shabbat, so it's okay according to Bet Hillel. Okay, so not only that, it says, right, matrim im shemesh, they allow you with the shemesh. So what does that mean? According to Bet Hillel, you can go, like, let's say to the dry cleaner, like half hour before Shabbat, and give him your clothing. And yeah, it's right next to Shabbat. You're very close to Shabbat. But you didn't tell him to do it on Shabbat. He can do whatever he wants. If he wants, he could do it on Shabbat, or if he wants, he could do it on Sunday. You're gonna pick it up on Monday, right? Whatever it is. I don't care when you do it. It's not my business. Do what you want to do, right? I don't tell you to do it on Shabbat. That's what we're saying. So Bet Hillel allows you to do like that. Same thing also applies, to recently a friend of mine, just asked me regarding, I think I posted about this already, regarding, a person who orders online, right, merchandise on Shabbat, So the question is, right, can he ask the goy to bring it on Shabbat? That's the question, right? So the answer is that he cannot ask him to bring it on Shabbat. Because that means, he'd have to do some kind of a labor to bring it to you. But on the other hand, if you give it to him right before Shabbat, and you tell him, what, I want you to send this, right, whatever. But I'm not telling you to do it on Shabbat, right? I'm not telling him to do it on Shabbat. He can do it whenever he wants, whenever it's good for him. So you can give it to him again, right? Half hour before Shabbat, you hand it over to him, say, okay, bye-bye, Jack. Right? I'll see you. That's it. So same thing also applies there as well. Same concept, You can give it right before Shabbat, but you can't ask him to do it on Shabbat. So therefore, when you're checking off the box for your delivery, right, for the online, right, the merchandise, you shouldn't check the box which is Shabbat, because then you're asking him to bring it on Shabbat. That's the thing, So you don't want that, right? That's not allowed. But if he himself, on his own volition, wants to bring it on Shabbat, so okay, fine, Here's my door, put it right there. See you later, right? Have a nice day. That's it. And then he asked me another interesting question, which is that what about if the goy calls you, right? This company calls you up or sends you whatever email and asks you, can we bring it on Shabbat? Are you allowed to say yes? So I told him, I said, no, you're not allowed to say yes on that. But we came up with a better solution, which is that you can tell the goy like this, right? He asks you, I want to bring it on Shabbat. So you tell him, not yes. What you tell him is, like, do what you want to do. It's up to you. I'm not telling you what to do. So then he's doing it for himself, not for you. You didn't ask him. So that you can tell him, do what you want. Have a nice day. See you. That's it, right? That shouldn't be a problem.
Can you take possession on Shabbat though?
Right, that's the thing, So in my post, I wrote that as long as it's not muktzah, right? That item. So definitely you can pick it up. There's really no problem there, you know. As we said, right? It has to. You have to have the conditions, right? If it's outside, you need an eruv, right? If it's indoors, so then depending on where it is, right? It's the placement. If you're allowed to carry in your building, right? Depending on the situation there. But the point is, right? In general, right? There's no problem to take it on Shabbat as long as it's not muktzah and you're allowed to carry over there. And also, you have another thing, right? What about opening the package? So that you're allowed to do. Why? Because you're ripping it, but it's destruction. You're going to throw it away, right? So you're not making anything there. So therefore, you're allowed to rip it up and open it. That's only if you really need it, though. Like you want to use it for Shabbat. Otherwise, why should you open it? There's no purpose for that.
So there's no issue with transfer of ownership?
Ah, well, it's already yours. You bought it already like 2 weeks ago, right? You ordered it.
Okay, so
You're gonna be waiting, right?
the person who's delivering like from the shop isn't bringing it to you and transferring ownership to you.
So you already made the kinyan when you paid for it, with your credit card. You know what I mean? That's it.
Thank you.
So you're not buying it now. Yeah, I see what you're trying to say, right? I see the point there. Because the truth is, right, that there is a halacha like this, that a person is not allowed to give his fellow, right, a gift on Shabbat, even though there's no money involved. But here's the thing, right? Over here, it's not really a problem. Why? Because you already purchased it before, number one. Number two, as I said, right, if you want to use it for Shabbat, you're allowed to take a gift. So if you really want to use that item, open it up and use it, Otherwise, if you don't really need to use it, just, put it somewhere and wait till after Shabbat and then open it up. One or the other, right? That's basically the basics of this whole concept of delivery on Shabbat. That's how you do it, basically, more or less. So, right, getting back to where we are here, the point is, right, similar, that you can't tell the goy, to do things on Shabbat. But says Bet Hillel, you can bring it like right before Shabbat and let him do what he wants, right? That's his business. But according to Bet Shammai, right, you have to only give him something which you can finish before Shabbat. Otherwise, you're not allowed to give it to him. Okay, let's move on a little bit. So it says, and he continues the Gemara there. ואפילו בית שמאי לא אסרו כשהוא עושה בשבת. So it says even Bet Shammai didn't really, forbid when he does it on Shabbat. אלא כשאין שהות ביום לעשות. It's only if there's no time to do it besides Shabbat, before Shabbat. That's when he's particular about it. ונראה כאילו אומר עשה בשבת. Why? Because then it looks like he told him to do it on Shabbat, according to Bet Shammai, right? Okay, great. So that's the story there. But we paskin here like Bet Hillel, so we're not really concerned so much for this. That's exactly what he says here, right? וקיים עליהם כבית הלל, ובכמה מקומות דין זה פשוט. So he says we paskin like Bet Hillel, and there are several places in the Talmud where this concept is mentioned, right? This halacha. Umash katav, and that which he wrote, Rabbeinu, the Tur, katzatz damim, that he made also a fixed price, but dafka nilmad. Only in that case, he says we learn from there. We learn not from there, but we learn this from midin ha'igeret, the rule of the letter, right? As we said, when you're sending something in the mail, a letter in the mail. Shitbaer beperek zeh. We're going to explain this in this chapter, right? Regarding mail, also we're going to talk about. So we're getting there. Okay, great. So it goes on. Katav Rashba. Says the Rashba, "V'dafka bebeto shel goy." So he said that's only in the house of the goy. So meaning what? That if he's doing the labor in his house, where people don't readily see it, right? It's not it's not visible to the public. But bebeto shel Israel, when it comes to the house of the Jew, though, afilu bekibolat metaltalin asur. So he says even if you fix a price, right? It's not allowed. Why is that? Because then the Jews will see, right, that the goy is doing labor on Shabbat for the Jew. So this we don't want. So if you take it to the dry cleaner, right, it's not really a problem. Why? Because he's doing everything indoors. He's not doing dry cleaning outside, right? So therefore, nobody's gonna see, right, that your merchandise is being, right, your clothing is being, laundered on Shabbat there. Right? Nobody's gonna notice that. So we don't care about that. So who do we really care about? We care about Jews, right? We don't want Jews to see this. If the goy sees it, what do I care? It doesn't matter. That's the idea. Okay, great. So just to reiterate, right, what we said before, just to want to make it clarify this. Once you made a purchase on an item, from a goy, right? You purchased something, and that purchase happened before Shabbat. So the thing is, now that he brings it to you, he's not, you're not transferring the ownership at this point, right? It's already been transferred with the purchase, it was already transferred then. So it's not really, the same thing. If you think about it for a second, right? Once a transaction has been made, that item belongs to you. It may be placed somewhere else right now. It may be in the warehouse, right? Whatever it is, but it belongs to you, that item. So you're not really acquiring it on Shabbat, per se, as an acquisition. You're just taking it, physically. It's not the same thing, really. Okay, great. So let's move on a little bit. So then he brings this Yerushalmi here. Omanim goim shayu osim im Israel betoch beto. Asur betoch betehem mutar. So he says, right, if you have like some kind of a craftsman, right, who's, doing some kind of work, a goy. If they're doing it in the house of the Jew, it's forbidden, right, on Shabbat. But if they're doing it in their own house, right, or in the store also, right, doesn't matter, it's all the same. Right, mutar, then it's allowed. When was that said? Says the Yerushalmi, the kibolet aval beschirut, right? That's only if he's kibolet, right? So what is kibolet? It means contracting, not right, but not schirut, not when he's your hired worker. He's an employee, right? If he's your employee, it's not allowed. But if he's a contractor, it's allowed. Afilu betoch batehem asur. So then, right, even in their house, it's not allowed, right? If you're hiring him as an employee. But when was that said? Betalush, that's something which is detached from the ground, right? But if it's attached to the ground, the karka, asur, then it's going to be forbidden. So, right, it's similar to what we said yesterday, which is that something which is, on the ground, everybody, can readily see that, it belongs to the Jew. But if it's something which is hidden away from the eye, so there, since they don't really see it, it's not really a problem. That's what we're saying. That's the end of it. Okay, great. Let's move on. Katub b'tshuvot Ashkenaziot, right? It says in this tshuvot Maharam, Yehudi hadar b'yishuv levado. Oh, so he says, what about if you have a Jew who lives in a, populated area? Asur liten legoy ma'ot le'askir lo pa'alim b'Shabbat. He's not allowed to give money to the goy to hire workers on Shabbat. And also Yom Tov. Afagav the leka mata the mekaraba lehatam. Even though there's no real town, which is in that vicinity. Bechutz letchum, it's outside the boundary of the city. V'hadeshare talmuda hatam. So he says, when the Talmud allows that over there, that's when there's no city close by in the vicinity there. In that boundary. But here, in this case, he says, his town is in the vicinity there. So he says, you know what the problem is? His household members will suspect him, that he's breaking Shabbat. Also, if he has guests, who came there to visit him, they also will suspect him. So this is the reason why he's not allowed to do it in this kind of scenario. Okay, great. Let's move on. How much we got left here? About 10 minutes or so. I think we can knock it off tonight. We can knock it off. Okay, let's see. So he says, Miklal divrei Rambam atalamed. So he says, you learn from the words of the Rambam here. Shadina sadeh shaveh ledin bait. That the field and the house has the same rule. Linyan kibolet, when it comes to contracting. Klomar, meaning to say that she'Yisrael asocher et agoy bedavar yadua. If a Jew hires a goy, for some kind of known labor or whatever, she'aseh lo b'melechet sadehu, he's going to do some work in the field there for him. Asur le'anicho la'asot lo melacha b'Shabbat. You're not allowed to allow him, to do labor on Shabbat. But lo min adin the Medina. So he says it's not really halacha. Why? Because according to halacha, vaday shari, it's allowed really this thing. The goy b'denafsheh kavid. Why? Because the goy is doing it for himself. Ela mipnei haroim shamru. But he says the only problem is, we have the onlookers, right, who are suspecting you, because they're gonna say shehu sachir yom. They're gonna say, oh, this guy, he's like a hired worker, for the Jew. He's an employee. He's doing his labor by way of a goy. B'Shabbat, on Shabbat. So he says, therefore, if the labor was situated outside the boundary of the town, Kol Ayarot Israel, of all the Jewish towns there, the Leka Ro'im Share, and therefore there's no Jews, who will see him there. It's okay. So from this language, by the way, it implies that if it's a totally goyish town, it's okay. There's no Jews there whatsoever. Usually you don't find that. There's Jews everywhere. So whatever. It is what it is. Anyway, let's move on. Katav Rav Magid. It says Rav Magid. Ve'aran besop perek avodah zarah. In the end of first parak of Avodah Zarah. בסוף פרק כל כתבי, also this parak, שיש מתירים בזה לפי some allow this kind of arrangement. לפי שהרועים תולים בעריסות. Because, the onlookers, right, say that, he's probably he's subletting it. It's okay, he's not really doing it for the Jew, he's doing it for himself. וכשאמר שמואל מקבלי קיבולת תוך התחום אסור, so when Shmuel said, right, that contractors within the boundaries is forbidden, lo amar ela bekibolet binyan. That's only, it says, when it comes to building, right, construction, renovation, as we said, right, things like this. Vehem zal chalku al divrei at matirim. So it says they argued, right, with the ones who are lenient. Ve'omrim shelo itiru chachamim ela kesheamet ken. So he says, they say, these rabbis, that the rabbis didn't allow this unless it's really true. Klomar means to say that what? That they're going to think, that he's subletting over here. But if they really investigate the matter, right? They're going to find that it's actually true. So what does that mean? The goy is taking a percentage over here, So he's like a partner, he's not really a worker for the Jew. So therefore he's doing it for himself. Therefore it's allowed. Okay. אבל כהי גבנה שהבעלים נותנים כל הפירות, but it says in this manner where the owners are taking all the profits, right? So what does that mean? The Jew, the goy is just taking some kind of a wage, right? Whatever it is. So then it looks like, he's just a worker for the Jew. That's what Tosfot says. Also there, Mordechai. Also Samak, all these rabbis say the same thing. Right? Let's move on. The Sefer Truma, also this rabbi. Right? Also this one. So he says, we learn from here the tanur regarding the oven, right, and the mill, and also a bathhouse. She'asur liskor goy b'davar yadua l'shana. You're not allowed to hire out the goy, to work there, for a year, like some kind of subletting, lease, whatever agreement, or lechodesh, even for a month, whether it's a year or a month. So what's the arrangement? He accepts, right, upon himself, the goy, to do all the labor they need. Right, so he does all the labor. He's taking, in other words, he's totally like, operating the system, the whole operation there. That's what it says. What this rabbi says, regarding the mill, right, which a water mill. So he says you are allowed to give it to a goy, the kablanut, right, as like, as a contractor. Who ledata matrim? This is according to the lenient opinion, it says, right, this whole thing. But the ones who are stringent about this, the karka, when it comes to land, mishum de michze lehu leinshe, because it looks, to people like he's a daily worker. Hu adin berechaim. So he says the same thing also applies to the to the mill. The Maishana, what's the difference, right? They're all the same. It's all the same concept. Ename, right? Alternatively, then when do we allow this? When it's outside the boundaries, right, of the city, town. Kol hayarot, all the towns, Israel, of the Jews, right? Again, right, we're saying that we're talking about towns where there are Jews. But it says it seems more likely Lomar the Rab Netronai, that this rabbi, Hakikama, this is what he means to say, that Echaim Shel Maim Hem Kelim. He wants to say that a water mill is like a utensil, umutar leaskiram legoy. So therefore, you're allowed to sublet it to a goy, to lease it, right, to a goy. Uperush bekablanut. So he says it means like he's becoming like a contractor. Klomar she'agoy mekabel alav. So what does that mean? The goy is going to do all the labor there, right? He's going to operate the whole thing, the whole outfit over there. Kol ma she'aleh peroteha. So he says whatever amount of fruits that grow there, right? Regardless, ben rav leben miat, whether it's a lot or a little, right? Bedavar yadua shenoten liYisrael bechol chodesh, and it's known like there's a fixed rate going on there, right? In terms of the payment, uh, every month or every year, right? So it's a yearly thing, lease, whatever, right? Monthly. והדברים מוכיחים שכן הוא דמייטה לגבי שביתת כלים. So he says that shows that it is so. In other words, the proof is in the pudding. In other words, you can see the way they operate. That's the way it is. Self-evident, right? As they say, right? והדברים מוכיחים שכן הוא דמייטה לגבי שביתת כלים. So it says he brings that regarding the issue of the rest of your utensils. ולעניין היתר עשיית גוי מלאכת ישראל. So then he goes on, right? What about, right, when the goy does the labor of the Jew, the davar talush, but something which is detached from the ground, right? Something movables, right? Bekablanut, and he's doing it as a contractor. Klomar sheposek imo ha'Yisrael letet lo davar yadua. So what does that mean, contractor? There's a set price there, for that labor. He's not working like an hourly rate or something like that. It says, שפוסק עמו ישראל לתת לו דבר ידוע בעד הריגת המה, אחד, for instance, right, he pays him a certain amount for a certain amount of labor, or בעד תפירת בגד, right, or, to weave clothing and so forth and so on. אחד מפורש, it's explained, Yerushalmi, it's explained in Yerushalmi, שהבאתי בסמוך, right, that we brought already, close by. והיינו דתנן פרק כמה לשבת. So he says, this is the same what we learned in the first parak of Shabbat, Yud Zayin Amud Bet. Bet Hillel, according to Bet Hillel, notnin orot leavdan, you're allowed to give, right, hides to the tanner, the kelim lakoves, and also, to the laundry, right? You can give your clothing, nochri if he's a goy, etc., etc. So we're going to talk about this, more at length regarding, the issue of giving to a goy, right, to do your labor. Chapter 252. B'siyati dishmai, right, with God's help. Ukvar katabti b'siman zeh, it says, I already wrote in this chapter, Divrei Rav Magid, the opinion of the Rav Magid, the Divrei Rashba, also Rashba, shehem ke Divrei Yerushalmi. So they seem to go like the Yerushalmi. Okay, great. So that's the end of the Bet Yosef. So let's see the Shulchan Aruch. So this was all. That was all Aleph. Can you imagine? Ooh, big one. Okay. Okay. So next will be Bet. So it says here like this. And eno yodea shekatzatz. I'm sorry. So it says like this. Posek im eno yudi ala melacha. So what does that mean? He's allowed to, like, cut a deal with a goy regarding labor. The kotzetz damim, right? So they're gonna make us like a set price, the eno the yudi osel atzmo. So therefore, since the price is set, the goy is doing this for himself, not for you. He's not your laborer, right? It's a contractor. That's what we're saying. Okay. Even though the guy is working on Shabbat, what do I care, right? I didn't tell him to do it on Shabbat. Whatever he wants to do, he does. So he says, mutar, it's allowed. But when was that said? That's only if he's doing it right in private, as we said, right? It can't be something which is out in the open and people see it, right? Like construction, as we said, right? That's in the out, right on, in the open. So שאין מכירים הכל שזו מלאכה נעשית בשבת של ישראל היא. So what does that mean? Because it's not in the open, not, people don't know or don't suspect, right, that this labor is going on for the Jew. Nobody knows. That's the reason why it's allowed. אבל אם הייתה ידועה ומפורסמת, but on the other hand, right, if it was known that what? That it's for the Jew, right? This everybody knows that this is the labor of the Jew. Asur, that's forbidden. Why? Because of suspicion, right? Because the person who sees, right, that goy, doing the labor of the Jew, they don't know, right, that they made a fixed price. You may think, just he's a laborer like that. He's doing labor for him. He's a worker. So they're going to say, oh, this guy, right? He hired a goy, to do labor on Shabbat. So therefore he says, right, if we're talking about construction to build something, right, which is outdoors, and people see it, right, what's going on, all kotlu, right, is building a wall, right, whatever, construction, renovation, or to reap the field, harvest the field. So as we said, right, if it's within the inhabited portion of the of the area, whatever, or it's within the boundaries of the town, so you're not allowed to let him to do this on Shabbat, right? So what you gotta do is, object, and say, sorry, but on Shabbat you guys can't work here, Take a vacation, Take a day off. Take it easy on the weekends, But that's it. That's what you tell them. So he says, why is that? Because since the people who see this, right, don't know that they had a fixed price, he's a contractor, they don't know all these things. But technically speaking, right, what do you see from there? Technically speaking, a contractor should be fine, It's just because of the suspicion that that's what we're worried about. Why is that? Because a contractor is working for himself, not for the Jew. He's not an employee. Independent contractor. That's what it's all about. Okay, fine. So let's go to the Rama. Says Rama here, im dar bena of the kochavim. Look what he says, right? Even if he lives amongst the goyim, yesh lachush leorchim abayim sham. But he says we're concerned, about the guests that are coming there. Livnei beto sheyachshedu oto, and also the family members, right, that will suspect this, Right. So we did see another opinion which said that if there's no Jews living there, it's okay. So there is some room, to think about this, to weigh this. But the Ramah here brings the other opinion, right, which is more stringent. Okay, fine. But he says, on the other hand, right, if the labor was outside the boundary altogether, right, and there's no other town over there, right, in that vicinity, that they're doing the labor, mutar, then it's allowed. So interestingly speaking here, right? What I want to point out is that here the Shulchan Aruch himself doesn't say that it really hinges on, the issue of whether there are Jews living there or not. He doesn't really, right? It's not really contingent on that. It just says there's no other towns. So that implies somewhat, that he's stringent, like, what the Ramah says. Okay, that's very interesting. Veno Yehudi she'echnis son shel Yisrael ledir sadeu. Now it brings another issue, right? Which is, what about if the goy brings sheep, right, of a Jew to his barn, to his field right there. So what happens with that? So says Ramah here, Ayin El Siman Tav Kuf Lamed Zayin. Look over there, he says, right, in this chapter, Sif Yud Dalet. Okay, well, what about here? What are we talking about here? Gam Eni Achet B'Toch HaTchum. So there's no other city there. Yeah, so basically what it seems to be saying is like this, Shulchan Aruch, that if the goy took your animals and he placed it on his property, right? So there it's private property, nobody really sees it there. So apparently, right, that's also allowed to do it like that. So that would resemble, like in our case, where the goy is working in his store, so that's his private property. So we have no business with that, So whatever he wants to do there in his own privacy, we have no problem with that. That's basically what he's saying. Okay, so I guess we'll stop here, B'ezrat Hashem. We'll pick it up next time. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. Chazak u'baruch. And we'll see you tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem.
Thank you, Rabbi.
God bless.